Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 129. Pyro! John, unlike Rogue, didn't bother to think about or plan for the future. It wasn't that he was suicidal or anything like that. It was just that the first 14 years of his life had taught him a rather brutal lesson about the folly of trying to predict or plan for the future. You survived each day as it came. Maybe if you were lucky, you could manage a bit of planning for the next day. But yeah, mostly you just put everything you had into surviving the day you were currently living. 3 years at the mansion had in no way lessened that early training. Hell, if anything, it had reinforced it. Just in a way that had been a lot less unpleasant. Weird and unpredictable stuff was always happening at the mansion, but it was only very rarely shit that was dangerous to life and limb. It was generally just, well, weird and unpredictable. That said, it was nice that in the last 3 years, his life seemed to be on the upswing. As exasperating and irritating as being treated like a kid had been at the mansion, it had beaten living on the streets all to hell and back. Sure, he'd wanted to punch people's faces in on a distressingly frequent basis. He'd also had a temperature-controlled roof over his head, all the food he wanted to eat, and he'd gotten to educate himself. All without lying, stealing, or worse, selling his services. And Jean's stunt that last day aside, no one had ever raised a hand to him either. Jean aside, no one had yelled at him unless he legitimately deserved it either. And John was honest enough to admit there'd been times he had deserved to get yelled at for the stuff he'd pulled. To this day, John was pretty sure he'd caught the prof on the back foot with his eagerness to resume his schooling. The prof had been thrilled he wasn't going to have a fight on his hands getting John to do the homework and tests thing, but still. Certainly a lot of the street kids John had interacted with had considered so-called book learning a waste of time, energy, and effort. John, though, had been one of the ones that at least tried to keep himself educated as best he could. John didn't know about any of the other kids that had tried to keep learning, but John had done so under the belief that ignorance could and would get you killed. Life on the streets may have been hard, but it had still been life, and John hadn't come anywhere near the point where he had given up on life. Coming to the tower had been like heaven on earth. Seriously, literally no one rode his ass about anything or tried to make his decisions for him or any of the other stuff that had annoyed the crap out of him at the mansion. They trusted him to know his own limits and capabilities and just generally treated him like an adult. It was awesome! Yeah, he technically wasn't an adult age-wise, but the Avengers all recognized that for whatever reason, and God bless them all, they didn't pry into that either, but let him give them info at his pace. He was of an adult, or at least adult-ish, mentality ahead of schedule, and let him be, while also making it clear that if he wanted to ask for advice, they were available. All of which brought John to this point, wherein he was dressed in black leather, wearing a Stark-made ignition system for using his mutation. Sitting in a Quinjet as they flew to God's be damned Montana to kick Hydra butt. Sitting next to a quietly bitching Logan. John had no idea why Logan had such a problem with flying, but honestly, it was funny. Because while John had long ago stopped thinking about and planning for the future, he was not by any stretch of the imagination above fighting tooth and nail to keep the currently awesome life he had. On top of that, while John had, in the past, had little to no time or energy to spend on being concerned about the welfare of others, the whole mess with James Barnes pissed John off something fierce. The kinds of monsters willing to do that sort of stuff to a fellow human being had officially lost their own right to life as far as John was concerned. He would have zero problem burning them alive if he got to them before Barnes, or worse. Seriously, so much worse. Homicidal Captain America was scary. Roger's dead. Given he still had nightmares and flashbacks about his manifestation and the accompanying impossible-to-forget reek of burning human flesh, that kind of said something. But still, that said, that wasn't his objective today. Just like last time, he was on containment, herding, and structure deconstruction. Also, he was in charge of making sure all fires stayed under his control and didn't hurt an Avenger. Last time, he hadn't had to do much in the way of hurting. Mostly because folks had gotten one good look at whose heels he was nagging. Not to mention expressions on their faces. See previous comment about Barnes and homicidal Captain America. And opted for much bloodier but faster deaths elsewhere. Mostly on Logan's claws, interestingly enough. Like they knew of him and knew what his response would be to someone coming at him in a fight. John wasn't sure if or how many of the Avengers had caught that, or if he'd been imagining it. He hadn't brought it up because he wasn't sure he hadn't imagined it, and he wasn't sure just how significant it was if he hadn't. Logan had, after all, been wandering around doing his thing for a while before he and Rogue met. That made it entirely possible that the Hydra assholes knew of him from period, and not because they'd been in on whatever had been done to Logan that he couldn't remember. That said, John was cynical and a realist, and honestly, the odds on Hydra not having been involved in whatever happened to Logan were not good. Not good at all. So really, these raids were twoffers. Or was it three first? 1, Hydra, just plain needed to not exist. 2, they needed paybacks, and how? For Barnes. And 3, on the assumption they were involved in Logan's life, they needed paybacks for that too. Barton brought them in low and fast, pretty much kissing the treetops in order to post it under the radar, literally, and give the little middle-of-nowhere airport the least amount of warning of their imminent arrival possible. That is, if anyone happened to be looking the right direction at the right time to see them. There wasn't anything anyone could do about the area around the airport that had been cleared of trees to allow for the approach of planes, but that area wasn't really all that big. They'd get all of about a minute to get a welcoming committee ready once the jet hit that area. Logan, just like last time, bailed out the second the jet slowed down enough that he wouldn't become a smear on the ground when he hit. Hilariously, Rogers and Barnes were pretty much right behind him, bailing out before the jet's wheels hit tarmac. The rest of them, not being insane, nor able to heal from mortal wounds in seconds, waited until the jet came to a stop. Of course, by then the screaming had already started. Logan, Barnes, and Rogers made for a heck of a triad in the pain, bloodshed, and death department. The moment John was free of the jet, he lit a spark and flicked his hand, sending the flame towards the tree line. It landed in the grass about 20 feet from the trees and caught. Another hand wave, and the fire immediately raced around the airport following the tree line. As it went, the flames leapt higher and got hotter until they were nearly blue-white. Even Logan wouldn't hesitate to challenge a fire that hot, or so John hoped, which meant the Hydra goons were effectively trapped inside that fire line. John was very, very careful to keep the flames away from the trees, and to keep the heat as close to the flames as he could, so that a massive forest fire didn't get started. He'd be able to stop such a thing, of course, but it was just plain better to not let it get started in the first place. Gambit had immediately targeted the airplanes with his charges blowing off or at least badly damaging the plane's wings. With their means of escape cut off, all attention turned towards kicking butt and taking names. And yeah, the whole, oh shit, no, I'm not tangling with those two. I think I'll go die on Wolverine's claws instead. It'd be less painful. Thing was definitely still in effect. Honestly, the sheer blind terror on the goons' faces when they spotted Barnes and Rogers was never going to get old. John knew for a fact that at least 2 folks at the castle raid had literally pissed their pants. You couldn't buy that kind of entertainment. Of course, to be completely fair, the goons at the castle had been dealing with apparent zombies on top of dealing with Barnes and Rogers. So, John figured they'd had good reason to piss themselves. John sure would have in their shoes, even if he still had his mutation, because damn. John stayed tucked in behind Barnes and Rogers as they forced their way into the hangar. Gambit was quick to make the couple planes in there as useless for escape as he had the ones outside. John cut the fires off before they could really get started. Outside, it hadn't mattered if one of the planes caught fire. In here, it was an entirely different matter. There was a whole heck of a lot of stuff in here that would become flaming shrapnel if a gas tank blew or something like that. It took less than 10 minutes to subdue and or kill the goons. Once they were absolutely sure there were no other people, John mentally extinguished the containment fire outside, then staggered and blinked stupidly for a moment as everything went wonky. He nearly had a heart attack when Natasha was abruptly in his face, mostly because he knew she and Clint had gone to deal with the control tower, which was on the far end of the airport, and seriously, she was a teleporting ninja. All right, John told her, waving somewhat drunkenly and fighting what was bound to be a very goofy grin. Not used to that big or that hot. Overextended yourself, kid. And that was Logan's gruff, late, concerned growl. John shook his head. This was something he'd never really been able to explain any kind of clearly. The fire was more or less a living thing under his skin, something he was aware of virtually every second of every day, and it never stopped being hungry, which was part of the reason he'd played with fire so much in the past. Even when he was calm and happy, that hungry, let me do my thing sensation was always there. It just got exponentially worse when he was frustrated or angry, which had been a daily thing at the mansion. The thing was, when the fire got to do its thing, even for a second, there was at least a brief flicker of, hell yeah, that's the stuff. The longer it got to play and the bigger it got to get, the bigger that sensation was. And he'd just done, hands down, the biggest flame job since he'd manifested. Not even the castle raid had been this big, mostly because Hulk had done the bulk of the work on reducing the blaze to so much rubble. So he was a little punch drunk on glee and satisfaction, and yeah, it took him a minute or two to shake it off and get it under control. Once he did, he straightened. Sorry, not overextended or anything like that. Just a little overwhelming getting it back under control, John told them. Natasha gave him a look that said very clearly she was not buying what he was selling. So did Logan, for that matter, but both seemed willing to let it go since he wasn't acting exhausted or overextended. He'd try to explain it properly later. We found a logbook, Glenn said as he walked up, waving a... Was that really a notebook? As in the kind you could buy at virtually any store and that tended to be used for notes in school? Really? John had nearly started laughing at the incongruity of it. Unfortunately, it's safer. There's nothing on the computer records-wise. Just what they need to help pilots with their approaches. It didn't take long to find the access to the underground storage. It took even less time to ascertain that the place was roughly half full and that, no, there wasn't a manifest of any kind telling what was where or what was in which crate. The good news was that the crates were all in the middle of the room, rather than being stacked against a wall. That would make sealing the room a lot easier for John. Less of a worry that something would go kablooey thanks to radiant heat when he did his thing. At that point, they all got the heck out. Once well clear, John glanced at the others. I'm probably going to be giggling like a loon when this is done, he warned them, because seriously, he was still a little on the giddy side from the containment fire. This was going to be every bit as bad, if not worse. He lit a spark and let it fly. Within seconds, he'd built it into not a raging inferno, but the sort of ultra-focused, ultra-hot contained blaze you'd find, appropriately enough, in a foundry. It didn't take long for glass to start to melt or metal to glow. Not long after that, the metal started to go liquid and the whole hangar literally melted into the ground, creating a cap that was, if not completely indestructible, was going to take a lot of effort to get through or work around. And sure enough, when he shut the fire down, John started to giggle. If it had a slightly maniacal edge to it, no one really paid that any mind, given where they were and what they'd been doing. Maniacal giggling at hurting Hydra in some way was not a bad thing. Despite the giggling, John made due mental note to figure out a way to get a handle on things when he worked fire at this level, because getting all punch drunk and giggly might not always end well. Here, it didn't matter because there were no bad guys left to pose a threat. But if he got this way mid-battle, yeah, problem.